I'm going to talk about exit strategies through the investor lens. And I want to start off by saying that I think that history is going to call the time that we're in right now a golden era for entrepreneurs and angel investors. Never before has it been so easy to create such valuable companies using so little capital and sell them so early for so much money. That was the good news. The bad news is that if we were going to be honest here, I'd like to ask, without a show of hands, how many of you actually discussed the returns on your angel investment portfolio with your husband or wife? And I'm going to say it. Today, in 2018, still, most angel investors lose money. But the good news is, it's not just you. And I think it's important to talk about it. And I know from being an angel for a couple of decades now that we're getting much better every year at being angel investors. And I believe we still can do far better than we're doing today. And I want to start off by acknowledging that generating a consistent return on any investment portfolio is not easy. And it's especially challenging for what we as angels do. And I believe that being an angel investor is actually more difficult than being a venture capital investor. Partly because we invest early, but that's only one of the reasons. You know, in the venture capital world, VCs have been doing what they've been doing for a long time. And a very famous Silicon Valley venture capital fund manager, John Doerr, said that training one new VC is as hard as training a fighter pilot. So what John Doerr has said is that the cost of educating one new partner at Kleiner Perkins so that they can be a successful venture capital fund manager takes 6 to 8 years and costs $20 million. And remember, being an angel is harder than that. And one of the reasons is that angel investing is still quite new. You know, the early angel groups started in the mid-90s, and today I think that where we are is where traditional venture capital was in the mid-80s. So I think we're like 25 years younger than the venture capital industry at least. And we as angels are still discovering best practices. And that's the second reason that being an angel is harder than being a VC, because there is no manual for what we do. The big opportunity I want to try and leave you with today is that I believe that only about 25% of the companies that we finance that could be sold actually end up exiting. And so what I'm saying is that 75% of the time, when we find some entrepreneurs, we invest some of our capital, we mentor these companies, we do everything we can to help make them a success. 75% of the time, when they are successful, they still fail to exit. And more heartbreakingly, the most likely result is that they will then fail completely. Now, I want to emphasize, this is not hard data. This is my observation after doing this for a long time. I'm looking forward to having data that could prove this. But there's some judgment involved in the definition of saleable as well. But it's somewhere in this neighborhood, I'm sure. So what I'm saying is, if you looked at all the companies that were either bootstrapped or angel-backed, about a quarter of them have successful exits. About another quarter have what I would consider to be suboptimum exits. And about half have no exit at all. And this is, again, not of the ones that we invested in. This is the ones that were saleable. Companies that could have had an exit, half the time don't, a quarter of the time didn't get a fair deal for the investors. I think that's great news. And the reason I think that's great news is we can do much better. We can make that probability much higher. And I think that entrepreneurs and angel investors would have better returns and, quite frankly, just have more fun if we designed and built more of our companies with clear exit strategies. And it's working particularly well in today's economy. And the big opportunity, and what gets me excited about the future for angels, is that this is just an education challenge. It's knowledge that we're lacking that's resulting in these dismal final outcomes for our companies. And that's, of course, why I think meetings like this are so important, is they're opportunities for us to get together, to exchange ideas, to learn from each other, to improve the outcomes for the angels and, of course, for our entrepreneurs. And one of the things that drives me crazy about the current state of knowledge in the M&A part of the entrepreneurial ecosystem is that I often hear people say companies are bought, not sold. And I'd sold several companies before I really even understood what people were saying there. But it's one of those myths, misperceptions, I would even say outright lies, that are so common in this part of the system. And I think it's just plain wrong. I think that what people are saying when they say that is that they think magically, somehow, when it's time, someone's going to come and knock on the door and ask to buy the company. And I have to admit that does happen. In fact, it happens far too often. But it's almost never a good thing for the shareholders when it does happen. And it's not just because the price is going to be much lower in that situation, but more importantly, the probability of success decreases dramatically when there's only a single interested bidder. And I'm hoping that you'll take away from today that optimum exits require strategy and planning. And I'd like you to consider that the exit is just another business process. And we know that whether we're doing a financing, a product development, or whether we have a marketing or sales goal, our chances of success will increase dramatically if we have a good plan. And I would suggest that the exit strategy is simply the plan for the business, the entire business. And like all good plans, it should start at the end with the goal. And I think that every company should have a clearly articulated, regularly reviewed exit strategy, in part to prevent some of the governance challenges that Anna was talking about just before lunch. I loved her example of how many times she's seen boards that couldn't agree on what to do when an exit opportunity presented itself to a company. So I think that the exit strategy can actually be pretty simple. It's only got two essential ingredients. And a perfectly workable exit strategy is to say, our exit strategy is to sell, fill in the name of the company, in about blank years for blank dollars. That's all you really need to get alignment on to have a functional exit strategy. You can make it fancier by adding in intermediate milestones or some action items related to that goal, but really it's only those two essential ingredients to build the necessary alignment. And one of the opportunities that I think exists in the current entrepreneurial ecosystem is for the angels to provide that input for the entrepreneurs. Typically, entrepreneurs are younger than angels. Typically, they're working on one of their first few companies, because once they have one or two successes, they're not going to be entrepreneurs anymore. They're going to be angels. So I think that what we can do is we can accumulate this knowledge. We can learn from being on more than a few boards and making more than a few investments. And we can help the entrepreneurs with this critical part of the process by being the ones that can provide the input, the mentoring, the guidance, the governance on the exit strategy. One of the things that I think would dramatically improve that dismal 25% success rate is if we just changed the sequence of the financing and exit strategy a little bit. And while I want to admit before I say this that this does not happen most of the time, what I believe is the right way to build a company is to, first of all, determine the type of business that it is. And by type, I mean type in the financial context, not in the kind of context of what is the business. Then to build alignment on that exit strategy, then develop the financing plan. And the reason I think this is the critical process and should be done before starting to contact investors is because there's no doubt that different types of investors are compatible with different types of exit strategies. And the model that I use whenever I use this part of my talk is a biological model, particularly apt for this audience, where what I think happens is that when you start a company, you've got a combination of some entrepreneurial DNA. It's usually quite compatible and very similar, and you end up with a young, usually thriving organism. But what happens when you combine that with some investor capital is, in my mind, you're adding in another type of DNA to this organism, and your resultant hybrid is a combination of the two DNAs. Now, I know that kind of breaks down in the biological world. That's not quite how it works. But the point I'm trying to get across here is that I think it's critically important to check the compatibility first. And the reason is, we kind of know from the biological analogy that when you combine incompatible DNA, sometimes the organism will seem to be doing okay for a while. But then usually in adolescence, you start to realize that something is seriously wrong. But up until pretty much now in history, you can't do anything to fix that. Once that DNA is combined, once that organism is launched, you can't go back and change it. And that's why I think this is such a useful analogy, is because corporations are the same. Once you accept that investor capital, once you combine that DNA, if you haven't done it carefully at the outset, it's almost impossible to repair. One of the other things I think would improve our outcomes is if we could appreciate the time delay in the exit process. And it's hard to say in general, but typically a well-designed exit will take 6 to 18 months. And what I wish is that in an ideal situation, the company's board would incorporate that time delay in the overall strategic and operating plan. And then look forward in time and start the exit process 12 to 18 months before the peak in the company's value. So what I'm saying is, in an extremely idealized way, just to make the example clearer, if we started a company, they typically grow fast when they're small, like small people grow fast when they're small. Then they get to a point where what I wish would happen is we'd start the exit 12 to 18 months before that peak in the value, and then in, again, highly idealized just model, we'd sell at the peak of the value. But unfortunately, that's not what happens most of the time. Most of the time, because entrepreneurs and angels are optimists, we wait until we get this feeling that the company's best days are actually behind it. We get this feeling that, there's more competition, and oh, look, the margins are compressing, and maybe something didn't quite work out with the science the way that we thought. Maybe we should sell the company. So we start the process once it's clear on the inside that the value has peaked. But the challenge is, because of that 12 to 18 month delay, by the time you get around to the serious negotiation, it's clear to everyone that this company's value peaked some time ago. And you end up very often exiting well past that peak in the value at a point when the return is much lower. And of course, that's a real heartbreaking financial loss for not only us angel investors, but also the entrepreneurs. But it's actually quite a bit worse for the entrepreneurs, because for them, there's this big part of their life that they're never going to get back. There's often years where they went to work, they worked their hearts out, went home every day a little bit poorer because they missed the ideal time to exit, and the value of their company, regardless of their hard work and inspiration, was declining. And I wish that was the worst news, but it's not. The worst news is that when that happens, very often you end up with a smoking crater. And this puzzled me for an embarrassingly large number of investments that I made personally, where I kept seeing over and over again when a company missed that time, or when we looked back and then with the benefit of hindsight realized we missed that time, we often ended up with a tax loss. And this bothered me for a long time, and it still bothers me a lot because I don't think anybody's really figured this out. But I do know, after having enough observations, that there are some consistent reasons that this happens over and over again. And I think that the good news is that we can learn from some of these experiences that cause this phenomena of total failure just by missing the optimum time. And we can think about how to avoid those in the companies that we've invested in. The reasons that this happens so consistently, not in a ranked order here, are number one, overinvestment by VCs, just competition, which is faster and more vicious than it's ever been before in this new hyper-connected world, intellectual property infringement, which is just wrong but is more rampant than it's ever been, something that I call negative momentum, which is a little bit more complicated characteristic of the current younger generation of people. The fact that markets are heating up and cooling off faster than they ever have before. A relatively new phenomena driven in part by the internet and the hyperconnectivity is something that I call waves of consolidation. It's a bit complicated to try and convey this in the time that I've got here, but the phenomena basically is where you see all of the companies in a space get acquired within a 1 or 2 quarter period. And I'm getting a lot of nods in the room because many of us have had that experience as investors. And one of the ways that you can be almost certain that you will have a total failure is if you miss that wave of consolidation. If you're not part of that wave, there's almost no way that a young company can survive it. And while it hasn't happened for a while, I think lots of us are old enough to remember times when the overall M&A market cooled off. Today we're at somewhere near the peak of the best M&A market there's ever been. My personal hope is that it lasts for another few decades, but realistically, being a student of financial history, we're probably somewhere near a peak. And, I don't know how many more years we have, but my sense is that, we've probably worked through the better part of this cycle and that there is a window that's probably starting to think about closing on this M&A cycle. And nobody can predict how long it might be before we get to the same level of exuberance in the M&A market. So what I think is that the biggest opportunity we have to improve the returns on our portfolios are to learn about exits. And AngelMD is providing some valuable opportunities for you to learn more about angel investing. And I've had the privilege of speaking with Tobin and Jens and others in the organization about some of the plans ahead to help AngelMD members learn to be more successful as angels, and also to help the companies that we are investing in be more successful. To develop the skills to help not only our own portfolios, but also to help the companies. That's part of what angels do. And I think the most productive thing we could do is to design the exit process early in the company's life cycle, ideally before that first investment, instead of waiting for an offer, as we've done too many times before in history. Tomorrow at 11 o'clock, I'm going to be also presenting a mini version of my exits workshop. And what I'm going to be doing is providing an overview of a full day exits workshop that I've presented to angel groups all around the world. And that is available in video on my blog if anybody wants to see it after seeing the overview. And I also wanted to say, and I've had preliminary conversations with Mark and Tobin about the idea that if there's interest, I'd also be happy to put on that full day exits workshop for AngelMD at some point in the future. So that's my quick introduction, and I want to wrap up by wishing all of you luck with all of your exits. Thank you. I've got a couple more minutes, but I know we're short of time. Go ahead. Any quick questions on exit strategy? Sir.
So tell us, you talked a little bit about how VC investment or overinvestment can really change the culture. Tell us a little bit more about how AngelMD changes that formula.
What's happening, which is so fascinating to me, is that over the last 5 or 10 years, companies have now the ability to raise tens of millions from angels. I've seen companies raise 50 million from angels. There's talk of some company that's raised 100 million from angels. So on one end, the need for venture capital has declined. But what's also happened, and is very rarely spoken of because it's not politically correct, is to acknowledge that on the buy side, amongst the strategic acquirers, they consider themselves in direct competition with venture capital. So the orders that are not publicly spoken are, in the corporate development teams, go out and buy these companies before the VCs can invest. And it's not that they bear them any ill will, it's just that the VCs will put a lot of money in and the price will probably go up by 10x. And the companies have capital today, so they don't need the VC money. Most companies have more capital than they know what to do with. So what they would prefer is, instead of having the company go through the whole VC cycle, maybe fumble around trying to do clinical trials badly for a few years. The companies today would much prefer to acquire before the VCs and after the angels. So there's a new kind of a optimum transition point where companies go through a bootstrap phase, raise some capital from angels, but then go right to being acquired. So the VCs are, in essence, being disintermediated by the new financial economy. And that's why the angels are so important, I believe, to the future of our economy. Sir?
Yeah. I presume an IPO is an exit. How do you determine early on if you really are a potential candidate for going public?
I would actually argue that an IPO is not an exit, it's just another mechanism for financing. It can be over time a gradual exit, but the answer to your question is actually quite easy. People who underwrite companies for a living, people who do IPOs for a living in the big investment banks, know exactly whether or not a company would be a good IPO candidate. And the kind of simple first order answer is unicorns. IPOs, especially today in America, have to have $500 million market cap. Right away, you're defining a small percentage of 1% of the companies that are acquired by defining the market cap. But they also have to be of a type that the average retail investor can understand and be excited about. So I think at the outset, near the founding, it's quite easy to determine whether or not a given company is likely to be a prospect for an IPO or an M&A exit. Any other? Sir. Oh, sir.
Basil, can I ask a question?
Sure.
You've shared one time that you just actually talked about one end of the spectrum, the IPO, but the vast majority of exit opportunities are in much smaller exits. It's also a space where investment bankers aren't going to touch it because they can't make money. So can you talk a little bit about that smaller, whether it's the $20 to $50 million range and the dynamics of that?
And we're going to touch on that a little bit tomorrow, but by way of an introduction, it's a great question. Thank you. I was quite surprised myself. I'd probably made my 100th early stage investment before I actually knew that the median size of M&A transactions across all industries in America is about $15 million. So what that means is that half the time when a company is acquired, it's being acquired for $15 million or less. Now that's very broad data. Unfortunately, we don't have any kind of segmentation within that data set. But it's an interesting thing to consider from an investment perspective, because what that means is that when we're looking at a young company, 50% of the time, the total returns to the entrepreneurs and the investors is going to be $15 million or less. So that really kind of is a sobering realization in terms of valuations that we can safely invest at. Of course, we're all optimists, and we're sure we're only investing in the ones that are in the upper half of the distribution curve, but sometimes... But Tobin brings up a really important point, I think, for angels, and that's that the market, which is probably 90% in transactions below $50 million, at least 90%, it might be 95%, that market is not well served by the investment banking industry. It's very hard to find high-quality M&A advisors that'll take on a transaction for total market valuations of less than 50 million. And the simple reason is that their fees are commensurately smaller, but it's actually harder to sell a company for 10 million than 100 million. When a company is worth $100 million, the buyers will fight to bid. When a company is worth $10 million, you've got to work really hard to get the attention of the people who might want to buy that. So the opportunity, I think, for the angels is to learn about how the process works, and to be able to perhaps be the team on the board that does design and execute the exit. And we're not all the way there yet. That's going to take some work, because this is not a simple thing to do, and it would take some kind of a concerted effort. But I'm not seeing the industry respond to the fact that exits have definitely moved earlier, and they're definitely smaller. There's no question about that. But the industry has kind of moved in the opposite direction, because there's been so much liquidity in the system as a result of what the central banks have done. And the people that are skilled in this craft have moved up market because they can. So that is the conundrum in how we as angels can capitalize on these new trends. But it's also, I think, the opportunity of how angel education can provide some of that knowledge to these younger companies that are the most desirable acquisition candidates, even for the very biggest acquirers. And we'll talk about that a little bit tomorrow as well. One last question? Sir.
One of the patterns that has been, seems to have been prevalent over the last 10 years or so is that angels have backed life science companies to a point where there's been either proof of concept developed or the company has gotten a little bigger. And then if it's attractive, the venture guys come in with terms that really cram down the angel investors either by way of valuation or by liquidation preferences and other financial terms. And even when the company then reaches a great amount of success, the people who benefit from that are the venture guys who came in later and not the angels. That, of course, goes against the whole concept of risk and return and relationship between those two. So it can be kind of disheartening for the folks who back companies early. Do you see that changing, or has it started to change with an increase of angel investing, or some of the other trends you discussed where it goes to a straight sale to a pharma or device company? Because, I mean, that's just, I've seen that time and again in this security.
Before I answer, let me admit that I actually started and ran a venture capital fund for almost 5 years. So I've sat at the table. I know. We all learn from some of the things we did wrong in our career. And so I've sat at the table, and it's bothered me greatly because I was at the table arguing against some of the things that some of those syndicates that I was in did to the angels and to the entrepreneurs. And what's really interesting to me is that the recent evidence is that not only do those venture capital investments usually bring bad news for the angels, there's some really interesting new evidence that's come out of Willamette University, Rob Wiltbank's group there, that's actually proven to a statistical certainty it's not good news for the entrepreneurs either. So I think what's happening is a simple Darwinian process where the fundamental need that the venture capital funds served is no longer required in the economy. But there are quite a few of my friends who are still running venture capital funds because they have some big ones and the management fees alone afford them a very nice lifestyle. So they're continuing to operate in the ecosystem. But with a small number of exceptions, lots of the time what they do is not healthy for the entrepreneurs or the angels or the ecosystem. And I usually get some hate mail after from somebody else who's been in the audience who's a venture capital fund manager. And I don't mean to disparage the whole class. There are a lot of younger venture capital funds that I often say to them are badly marketed because they're really angel funds. But the terminology isn't very precise. But when I say venture capital, capital V, capital C, Sandhill Road, limited partnership, institutional stakeholders, those funds are, I think, becoming extinct. And I know that over the last decade, the number of people working in those funds has shrunk by about 80%. So if that's an indication, they are becoming less important. But today, I said last night to an entrepreneur at the reception that I think that entrepreneurs should not put in their PowerPoints that they're considering a follow-on venture capital investment if they want to attract capital from angels for the reasons that you said. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. My time is up. I hope to see some of you tomorrow at 11. Thanks.